All right, welcome back to the show. We're now in chapter 3 of book 2 of the Nicomachean in Ethics, and chapter 3 is all about pleasures and pains. And as I've said repeatedly, Aristotle is not a Stoic. Aristotle is definitely saying that part of life is pleasure. It includes pleasures and pains. It's important. It shouldn't be the totality of things, but you shouldn't be the type that tries, like an ascetic, to just sort of eliminate it. No, that like the sort of the Spock approach to life. That's not Aristotle. Although he does consider that it's important to definitely get your views on pleasures and pains under control. That's what's key here, is the control of them to the best that we can. Not to get obsessive over things also. That's Aristotle as well. Don't obsess over anything. So the pleasures and pains thing that Aristotle's got going here is he says, look, when you look at people, we do think it's important for the types of pleasures and pains to look at the pleasures and pains that accompany their regular existence. In other words, it sounds a little bit more abstract than it is we do make judgments about people on what they consider pleasures and pains. Right? Again, if you recall in a previous video, I talked about educating your pleasures, and that is not just saying, well, whatever I take pleasure in, that's cool, there's no problem, or whatever pains me, that's cool, no problem. That's not Aristotle's view. And he says this based on things like, if you find a child that, like a little child, enjoying squishing ants or pulling legs off spiders, and enjoying it, that's the key thing. We say, oh, wait a second, you're not supposed to get pleasure in that. You're supposed to find that actually painful. That you've got this backwards with respect to causing grief to the ants. You're not supposed to get pleasure out of that. You should regard that as terrible when people step on ants or pull legs off spiders. So you got to flip that. So the whole thing here that Aristotle is taking is that we naturally try to regulate our pains and pleasures, and we make judgments about people when we say, oh my God, I can't believe he takes pleasure in that, or finds that offensive, or finds that appropriate, or whatnot. We do make all kinds of judgments, praising, blaming, etc., with respect to the pleasures and pains that people that accompany people's mental states or their bodily states, mental states, as they go about in life. So the person who so it tells us about the character. That's the key thing. Pleasures and pains tell us about character. So the character virtues and the moral virtues are all linked up. Don't identify with them, but it's important to take account of pleasures and pains. So the person who abstains from pleasures and can enjoy those acts of abstaining, again, without being obsessive about it. Remember, it's always about, as we'll look more, about trying to be following a mean, a doctrine of a mean, not moderation, but a mean, and we'll unpack those terms a little later. But someone who can refrain or control their tendencies to indulge in pleasures, and actually enjoys the act of controlling oneself, enjoys that, we would find that praiseworthy. Yeah, he's a pretty self-controlled person, or she's really got her act together. She can control these things, and enjoys a few things, but also enjoys maybe keeping things under control and not always indulging. So people that always indulge, we tend, says Aristotle, not to really respect that, because we regard it as a loss of maybe like a sophrosune, which is like a self-control. So seeking pleasures can, as Aristotle says, overly, obsessing, trying to have more pleasures can drive us into doing terrible things, bad things. Also, the getting too obsessive about avoiding pains, that can create problems too. Oh, I'm not doing that. I may not do the right thing. Why? It's too hard. It's too painful. So Aristotle says if you don't have your act together with regard to pains and pleasures, you're going to have a hard time habituating yourself into having good arete, like proper virtues. And of course, if you don't do that, remember, don't lose sight of all this, if you can't regulate yourself with pleasures and pains, you can't habituate yourself properly, you're not going to move towards the agathos, the human good, the eudaimonia. You're not going to be really happy. So if you think also of people that are kind of unregulated in their behavior, they're not listening to their reason, they're sort of indulging all the time, Aristotle could say something like this. Well, are they the happy people, Are the people that indulge in all kinds of things and let their emotions and pleasures and all these things run wild and run the show, so to speak? Are those the happy people? Aristotle would say, I don't think so. The people that tend to be happy are the people that are in charge of their own lives, and that is essentially conforming, or at least listening to reason. So character virtues have to do with pleasures and pains. Aristotle agrees with Plato that education, as I've mentioned previously, is all about educating you to have the right kind of perspective and attitudes towards pleasures and pains, and to feel them in the right way. Remember, the little kids with spiders and stuff like that, feeling the right pleasures at the right time. So moral virtue is not going to be, remember, as I've stressed, moral virtue is not going to be some sort of state of utter tranquility and kind of a sort of a semi kind of achievement where you're above all things and you're outside of all things, a withdrawal from the world. No, although we'll see a little later there's some tension in Aristotle, especially in Book 10 about what's kind of the happiest life. But by and large, no, it's not a withdrawal. Moral virtue is going to be a disposition. The character virtues and the morals, these are going to be a disposition for getting these, right? Pleasures and pains, right? That's what I mean by these. Getting these right. Having the right attitude towards pleasures and pains and feeling them in the right way. So moral virtue will be the disposition for getting these right, and vice will be another kind of disposition. That is the disposition for getting it all wrong. So again, the sources of the virtues is the same as the sources of the vices. It's just a matter of getting things right and getting things wrong. So according to right reason is what we should be living, says Aristotle. Again, he's going to unpack this more, but reason is the key here. So virtue and vice in some ways are kind of two sides of the same sort of character coin. And as a matter of fact, stamped coins are often called characters because it was a sort of a stamping on something. Anyways, there's lots of metaphors about the notion of character, so you can look that up. I'm not going to go into all of that. So the virtuous life, we could say, and the life of vices, they could be full of similar content, right? It's just the virtuous person has one attitude and disposition, and the vice-ridden person has a different attitude, different disposition. So, but it's not identical, because Aristotle is going to say some things you can't have at all, and and if you do, it's a vice. So Aristotle isn't okay with every kind of emotion and passion and thing. He's not saying that it's all okay in some kind of form of a mean. So we'll unpack that in a little later in Book 2, so stay tuned for that. But to help illustrate this, Aristotle says there are some basic objects. He lays out a little chart here, which I've reproduced more or less. There's objects of choice and objects of avoidance, and like the Greeks used to like to pair things up in opposites. So certain objects of choice, the noble, this is something that's good to seek. This is something, an object of avoidance, the shameful, that's bad in itself. The useful, the harmful, the pleasant, and the painful. These are things that you make the right choices towards all of these. So if you forget if you make the right choices here. So if you make the right choices, that's virtue. And with respect to all these, when you make the wrong choices, well, you're on the road to vice. So the virtuous person makes the right choices. The vice-ridden person makes the wrong ones. Now, Aristotle, as I mentioned earlier when I was talking in a previous video about capacities and all that, he doesn't think we're born blank slates. Yeah, you have a capacity to become good or evil. You have a capacity to have the disposition to indulge in pleasures or maybe not. But he doesn't say it in explicitly, but he does more or less talk about this, that some human beings, some of us, and many of us are born with certain kinds of inclinations in certain kinds of directions. This will come up in a number of places. So we basically, Aristotle kind of admits, we have, since the cradle, since you're born, there is kind of the grip or the tendency or sort of a disposition, although you don't want to say you're born with this, but there is kind of a tendency to go towards pleasures, right? Little babies, the mother's milk is kind of sweet. They tend to gravitate towards certain kinds of pleasures and away from other kinds of things like pains. So we're inclined from the cradle, Aristotle says, to go towards pleasure. So we have to be really on the lookout for that. We have to, again, most of all, beware of the pleasures, right? Educate your pleasures. Get them under control. Or they'll control you, basically. So we shouldn't just let pleasures happen and say, well, whatever I take pleasure in, that's okay. So it's difficult to fight, though. Aristotle says because these seem to be sort of kind of born, we're sort of born with these inclinations towards them, but we can control them, but they're not easy to control. So some things are easier to control than others. So this inclination of pleasure is difficult, but trying to control the hardest things that you are inclined to pull them back, those are the hardest, to use the old Platonic metaphor, those are the fastest horses, the strongest horses in your soul that are running in a certain direction. Controlling those is sort of the big fight that you have over small things, maybe that you don't really have a strong inclination towards. Go and control the strongest ones. That's where you get the best results. The most important results are the control of the harder things. Because success, Aristotle says, success in the harder is superior, more important, more useful, a better result than success in the easier. So don't just take the easier route. Why? Because the payoff won't be as much as if you take the harder route. Think about it when you're struggling to learn something. When you're struggling to learn something that's harder and you have success at that, that's going to be a bigger payoff than if you say, oh, I'll just stick to something that's easier. So Aristotle, again, has allusions to things like in sports, when you try and do a more complex move, or when you're trying to play a musical piece, if you're trying to learn something more complex and you figure it out, that will have much more of a positive impact and a superior impact, as Aristotle would say, on your skills as a musician than if you learned an easier piece or a less difficult maneuver in sports. So all of politics and morality, according to Aristotle, is about, at the end of the day, Aristotle's like Plato, it's about handling pleasures and pains. That's what teachers have to help people handle. That's what we work on ourselves. And of course, politicians, as I mentioned in the previous video, how ethics always just flows naturally into politics. If eudaimonia is going to be connected up with the character virtues, as it is, we've seen that, and the character virtues are closely connected to managing pleasures and pains and getting them right, well, the job of the politician also is to develop people that can achieve eudaimonia, develop the conditions under which we can do that. So politicians, too, should be aware of proper management of pains and pleasures and creating conditions under which people can manage their own and make the right choices with respect to them. Handle them poorly, though. Get pains and pleasures wrong, and you're going to be full of vice. And you're not going to be a happy person either. So, now, as I mentioned a little while ago, and this will lead me into chapter 4, it's important to note that it's not just good enough to conform to virtue. Aristotle doesn't really use this kind of language. But what's running in the background here is it's not just that you do good things, right? And then you're being a virtuous person. No, there's more to the story than that. If you read a little bit of Immanuel Kant, he stresses a big difference between just conforming to what he calls a moral law and actually having reverence for it and instantiating it in your soul and through your actions. In other words, there's a big difference between just doing the right thing as sort of a mechanical way, like a sort of a virtuous zombie, so to speak, and actually being virtuous. As a matter of fact, I take that back. Aristotle says you can't really be a virtuous zombie. You can be a zombie that has the illusion of being virtuous. So what does that mean? Well, let's look at sort of an example that's roughly similar to what Aristotle's getting at. The musician versus the poet. So in chapter 4, he wants to say, okay, look, there's an important part of the character virtues is not just the actions that flow out of them. There's an intrinsic element too, a psychological dimension, if you will. So if the musician, let's say, has all the skills, and you have and plays, let's say, a perfect piece, right? Let's say plays some little sonata or something, or it doesn't really matter, but plays it really well. We would say that all the value is in the product, is in the playing. We don't really care if about the internal states of the musician or whatnot. We could be moved and say it's wonderful, etc., etc. Even if the musician afterwards we found out maybe was not such a great person after all or whatever, we'd say, well, okay, but what he or she played was beautiful. So in that sense, there's a sort of an externality to it. And the musician could have just learned all the skills, just went in there and said, okay, I want to play a piece that's going to move people, and how do I do it? And then the instructor said, well, move your fingers like this. Oh, okay, and then learn, and you just eventually move your fingers like that, and bang, you can play the pieces that are perfect, and you move people. Aristotle says it's a little bit different with something like a poet. There's something more internal to the story here. It's to be a poet, you don't just happen to write it mechanically. Would we say that a computer that you program, let's say the structures and the rules for writing Shakespearean sonnets, right? Lay it all out, program it in, and then the computer just dumps out lines. Maybe that worked quite well. Would we then say the computer is a poet? Probably not. Well, maybe some people would. But in Aristotle's view, to be, he doesn't have the example of computers, but his is just like, well, if you just write things out, you're not really a poet, right? There has to be some sort of inner dimension to this as well. So this is Aristotle trying to avoid the notion, as I said, of sort of a virtuous kind of zombie, which he would say is an illusion. So in this sense, it's, as we had with the musician, the skills in playing that, it was really external. All the value was external. Here, we would say, yeah, to be a good poet, you need to produce. So there is something external there, but there's also something internal that would have to be part of it for us to say, yeah, you're a real poet. All right, so the action Aristotle talks about when we're talking about the virtues, there's really something, the character of the author of the actions is important. And character not just in terms of producing actions, but some kind of inner notion to the character as well. So the actions done with the character virtues are actually much more similar to that of the poet, in that sense that there's an external product that's important, but there's an internal side as well. Now, in general, Aristotle says, well, that an action that is done, in order to really call it an action, now I'm not going to get into Aristotle's theory of action, but roughly it's got about 3 components to it. So when we talk about something done as an action, it has to be done from a knowing perspective, so there's knowledge that's involved. It has to be done for the sake of itself and not some further notion, and it has to be done by a firm, unshakable character. Now, Aristotle says that for most skills, it really is this one. This is most important for most skills. It's done from a knowing perspective. That is important too in virtue, but not as important. As a matter of fact, Aristotle downgrades it quite a bit. So So this is for most skills, capacities and abilities, but this is what's key for virtue. This one, not so much, but for real acts of virtue, or virtuous acts, so to speak, they're done for the sake of themselves. So in that sense, Aristotle is not just a sheer consequentialist where, yeah, you just do it for the sake of the consequences. No, you're doing it for the sake of itself. So that implies something about your character as well, that you do the right thing because it is the right thing to do. It's not because you're doing it for the effects of doing the right thing, which is a consequentialist line. And also, it has to be not just haphazard. Right? It can't be just something, we wouldn't really think of these as virtuous acts that were just haphazardly done, or that they weren't done as a product of your character, or something that you want to do, or something that you're directly involved with, but it's just accidental. So Aristotle's trying to rule out this, again, this sort of virtuous zombie by saying it has to be done with this kind of intention of the sake of itself, and from a firm and unshakable character. And as we've seen, that takes time to build up. So virtuous acts aren't just done immediately. So you can't just look at the act itself from an external point of view and decide whether or not it's a virtuous act. You have to look at, shall we say, this internal aspect. This, in many ways, is picked up somewhat by Kant, because Kant does distinguish between actions that are good and they have good effects, and he has no problems with that, that's fine. But he often calls those kinds of things that are just externalities, just actions, they don't have any necessarily moral worth because they weren't done, let's say, for the sake of itself. You can think of how an action looks different if let's say, someone told you that they saved a puppy. Right? They saw a puppy that was in danger of drowning, and they went and grabbed the puppy and saved the puppy, and everyone cheered. And then when they were interviewed on the local news that night, and people say, oh, that was a great thing, you went and saved the puppy. You put yourself at risk to save that puppy. Why would you do something like that? Now, let's say the person said, to begin with, oh, I saved that puppy because it's right to save puppies. It's the right thing to do. I just acted on that. It's just the right thing to do is to go and save puppies from drowning. Or, that's case one. Think about the other one. If someone would have said, oh, well, the reason why I saved the puppy and put myself in some jeopardy or danger is because I knew that I would be praised in the newspapers for saving the puppy, right? I just did it for that reason. Well, case one and case two, it's still externally, it's the same action. The puppy was saved, someone jumped in and saved the puppy from drowning. But we would, when you look at these kinds of aspects and bring that in, Kant would say the person who just conformed was someone who did something that was good, but it didn't have any moral worth. Aristotle would say much the same. Really wasn't a virtuous act if you were in it for saving puppies, because you knew maybe you'd get a reward, or the mayor would give you the key to the city, or something like that. So there has to be not just an externality, there has to be something important. You're not really a poet if you just happen to make things rhyme that sound good, if they're not written from sort of this internal perspective of being a poet. And ethics and virtue is not just about knowledge. Aristotle is going to say, don't kid yourself, it's not just knowledge. It's got to be actions that are done for the sake of themselves and from this type of character in order for those actions to be truly virtuous. All right, so Aristotle stresses again that actions to be truly virtuous have to come from this kind of character, and he says that a just action is not just simply a just action in and of itself, but a truly just action is, yes, a just action. That's part of it, that's necessary, but the sufficient condition is when you add on, it's done in the way that a just person would do it. And in the first example of saving the puppy, in my example of saving the puppy, simply for the sake of getting the key to the city, that's not how a truly just and ethical person saves a puppy, right? That's like we would say, oh, that's somebody who's self-aggrandizing or interested in themselves. They would do something like that. the way that a truly just and ethical person saves a puppy then would be according to, well, I did it because it's the right thing to do. So this rider of just doing these right actions, these good actions, has to be supplemented by doing the right action or a good action in the way that a good and virtuous and just person would do them. So it's not just simply an externality. So this leads naturally into Aristotle's final comment in chapter 4. He says, so ethics isn't just about knowing. It's not just an abstract study. He stressed that in book 2, in book 2, chapter 2, as I mentioned earlier. It's about doing. It's not just about knowing. And don't take refuge in theory and think you're being ethical. Right? Aristotle says if you think that just knowing and just talking, taking refuge in theory is being ethical, you're kind of like the person that's sick, and good uses this analogy. Philosophy and medicine actually have been quite aligned throughout history. Many philosophers were in fact doctors. But this notion of thinking you can talk about ethics and be ethical is, as Aristotle says, that's like if you go to your doctor and you're sick and your doctor tells you about what's wrong and what you have to do, and yeah, you're really knowledgeable. Yeah, you've looked it up, and yeah, I get what I've got. I understand what I have, and I can talk about it, etc., etc. But that's not going to make you healthy if you just talk about it and you really understand it. You're not going to get any better. Same thing for ethics. If you just can talk about ethics and talk up a good show, that's not going to make you any better. You got to do something. So you can't talk your way into health, and you can't talk your way into character virtues. You have to do something. So talking and learning, yeah, it might be somewhat important for most skills, a little bit with virtue, but really it's more talk. It's actually things that are done and done from a certain kind of perspective. Okay, so now that Aristotle has established that the character, the ethos arete, are basically they're products of habit, ethos, right? So there's that connection between the old Greek term for habit and character. So they're developed that way. What is the definition of this ethos arete, which is standard? Aristotle always seeks a definition or a starting point, an arche that we've seen. That's as good as you can get, because remember, each discipline, each subject area only allows of so much rigor. Remember, Aristotle's always stressing, you can't look for mathematical rigor in ethics. You're basically being foolish if you do that. And likewise, you're foolish if you look for ethical levels of rigor and not mathematical levels of rigor when you do math. So what's this definition of this kind of ethos arete? Well, in a sense, Aristotle says, okay, well, what exactly is something when we talk about dealing with the soul and the contents of the soul? What are the things that you find in it? Well, the soul has three basic contents. Emotions that we have, right? It's a standard thing. Faculties and capacities, powers eventually that can be developed, and states and dispositions. Now, we tend to praise people, blame people for all kinds of things. And Aristotle says, really, we praise and blame people for certain things, like their virtues. We don't really praise and blame people for their emotions. If someone just happens to have a certain emotion, we say, well, okay, that's one thing, but we look at how you appropriate it. If you get angry, how do you handle your anger? If you have certain kinds of capacities that you do them, or that you have them, we are always looking for, what do you do with them? How do you use them? So these things then are not really objects of praise and blame. So not objects of praise and blame. But the virtues are, so he concludes, well, since we do praise people for their dispositions, their tendencies towards things, this is where really arte is located. So in that sense, Aristotle says, well, we've got a very general notion of the virtues and the vices. So you can put it this way: the virtues and vices. What are these? These are really states of soul. Okay, these are states of psyche, and of course, remember, it's going to be the distinctly human ones. So the distinctly human ones are the ones that are linked in some way, directly or indirectly, with reason. So don't forget, we're always talking about reason here. You can also think of them, rather than just states, a different translation, which I think is a little bit better, is dispositions. So tendencies of the soul to execute certain kinds of activities. So we've got now a certain kind of general definition that virtues and vices now are going to be states of the soul that are linked to reason, tendencies in certain directions. That's just the beginning. Aristotle was going to go much more deeply into this, but that's a topic for another video. Stay tuned.